Welcome to today's Talks at Pulitzer, featuring Luke Mogelson, a contributor to The New Yorker, who's reporting from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq the Pulitzer Center has supported over the years. Today, we'll be focusing on Syria. I am Ann Peters, University and Community Outreach Director at the Pulitzer Center, and it is a pleasure to have Luke with us. While we're waiting for more folks to join us, let us know on the chat where you're listening in from, what cities or countries that you're joining us from. And if you have joined us for earlier talks at Pulitzer, we welcome you back. And if you're new, welcome again. We wanted to let you know a little bit about the center. We've grown quite a bit since we began in 2006, then supporting just 9 reporting projects. In 2019, that number went up to more than 180 projects involving even more professional journalists, as many of the reporters worked in teams. We were grateful also to have 43 reporting fellows from our campus consortium partners, universities, and colleges. They completed projects in nearly 30 countries. And then we have public events like today's session. And I see we have folks from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Hawaii. So that's great. What a great distance you're listening in from. On our educational programs, they involve thousands of students and teachers each year as well. And for any teachers listening in or parents of school-age children attempting distance learning still, please check out our educational resources and printable lesson plans from our K-12 team. For all our reporting and educational resources, our online presence is at pulitzercenter.org. Now, a few housekeeping matters before we get the conversation started today. We'll be talking with Luke initially for 20 or 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time as well for audience questions. If you have any questions you'd like to ask us, the Q&A icon is where you should click and then put those questions in there. You can submit them as well while we're having these initial conversations. There is a chat icon where you put some of the locations you're listening in from, and that can be for more specific technology questions you might have. Please note that all attendees today are muted, but if you can't hear us, let us know in the chat box. We also want to let you know that we're recording today's session to post it online for others who could not join us today. One other housekeeping matter, please remember to stay online once this session ends to participate in a brief survey to help us better serve your interests. And now I'd like to introduce Luke Mogelson. Luke has been a contributor to The New Yorker since 2013. He is the recipient of the National Magazine Award in 2014. He also previously had been based in Afghanistan for the New York Times Magazine. His writing also goes beyond his journalism, with fiction appearing in The New Yorker, the Paris Review, and the Hudson Review, among others. He's the author of a short story collection, These Heroic Happy Dead. For his most recent Pulitzer Center-supported project, Abandon, Luke spent a month in northern and eastern Syria, reporting on the fallout of U.S. disengagement from that country. For 6 years, the U.S. military had supported the Syrian Democratic Forces in its campaign to defeat ISIS. And then the situation changed. Turkey attacked, President Trump ordered the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria, and the SDF negotiated an accord with the Syrian regime and its patron, Russia, upending the strategic balance in Syria. We'd like to start with some questions for Luke, essentially just when you did your pre-reporting research and so forth, what were your expectations prior to your arrival in Syria?
Well, I had obviously followed the Turkish incursion in October, and by the time I arrived there, the situation had kind of stabilized. And there were fixed front lines and areas of control among the various parties and factions, but it was extremely messy. So you had Russians and Americans and SDF and Turks, Turkish-backed militias, Arab militias. There were regime forces, all kind of mixed up in a relatively small geographical area. And so I knew it was extremely complicated, and I had a difficult time kind of visualizing what that actually looked like and how that kind of political reality looked on the ground and was being experienced by the people who lived in that area.
And then once you spent that time there, once you were on the ground, let's walk us through some of those first few days once you landed and were getting your bearings.
Yeah, so maybe I should back up a bit, because another part of the story that I was interested in was Raqqa, which is kind of farther to the south of the area that was affected by the Turkish invasion. Maybe we have a map, should we put that up?
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Give everyone a perspective on what we're looking at.
Okay.
So there's Raqqa, as you say, slightly south from the area bordering Turkey.
Right. So if you look up, like right on the border, on the Syrian-Turkish border, you'll see a town called Tel Abyad, and then to the east, Ras Alan, also known as Sarakani. And here, basically, those are the two first towns that were kind of attacked and when the Turkish forces invaded. And they pushed all the way to that line you can see that parallels the border, about 30 kilometers south of it, which is the M4 highway that connects Tal Tamir, and it's not marked on the map, but that intersection midway between Tel Abyad and Raqqa is a town called Ainisa. And Ainisa was the headquarters of the SDF, and it was also the main bureaucratic center for the autonomous administration of North and East Syria, which was kind of the civilian apparatus that governed all of the areas in northern Syria and eastern Syria that had been liberated by the SDF and coalition forces. So, and there was also in Ainisa a very large refugee camp. And that camp was largely occupied by people who had fled from Raqqa up that road there in 2017, when the SDF, in partnership with the coalition forces, which is basically the US, mounted an offensive, a large-scale offensive against Raqqa, which at the time was the capital of the capital of the caliphate for the Islamic State. So when the Turkish forces and their militias pushed across the border, they eventually made it all the way to Ainisa, and everyone in that camp fled. The SDF changed its headquarters to Hasaka, and the autonomous administration withdrew to Raqqa. And then basically after that, just to kind of bring everybody up to speed, you had a situation where essentially this rectangle that you can see on the map between Ainisa and Tal Tamir, Ras Alan, and Tel Abyad was occupied by the Turks. And on the other side, everything like outside of that rectangle essentially was under the control of the SDF, the Russians, and the regime. Just to complicate things a little bit more, also in Inisa there, a little bit on, actually that the map doesn't show it, but the M4 highway continues towards the west from Inisa. And if you keep going down that way, there were two large American bases. One of them was in a former cement factory called the Lafarge cement factory. It was a French cement company. And the other one on the other side of the road was called Syrian, and it was the largest American air base in Syria. And so when the Turks in October pushed into this area, the Americans were ordered by the president to withdraw, to pull out. And so all of the American forces and diplomats who were based in the Lafarge cement factory and in the Syrian air base moved up west on that highway towards Iraq. And actually, it was a rather dramatic situation, because at that point, that day, which I believe was the 13th, you had Turkish-backed Arab militia forces to the north of that highway and in the kind of desert areas to the north. And you had SDF, Kurdish-led SDF forces to the south, and also in the town of Inisa, which is just to the south of the highway. And they were shelling each other and shooting at each other. And the American convoy passed right in between them. And the two sides stopped fighting to let them pass. Then the Americans continued. The fighting continued. The Kurds managed to hold on to Inisa and keep the Turkish forces essentially north of that line that you can see on the map.
So it's the line between to the right is Tal Tamir, and then that's the road that you're saying is.
Yeah, but if you follow that line westward to the left towards the Mediterranean, and you see it connects against it abuts a perpendicular line,
right?
A vertical line that connects Raqqa and Tel Abyad. So that intersection there is basically where Inisa, it's not marked on the map, but that's basically where Inisa is. And that's where all this kind of happened. It's where you had the headquarters of the SDF and of the autonomous administration and this massive refugee camp, and not that far away to the west, the two main US bases in the area, and then also the approaching Turkish forces. So it was a really chaotic place with a lot going on, and one of the most kind of dramatic incidents during this withdrawal, which took place over the course of a few days, was the total evacuation of this refugee camp that had thousands of people in it from all over Syria, because they were caught in the crossfire. And there were also, by the way, I think about 800 detained family members of ISIS fighters in the camp, and they also fled. When they fled, they went north towards the Turkish forces, and when everybody else fled, they went south away from the Turks towards Raqqa, and most of them, a lot of them ended up in Raqqa, and many others, thousands of others actually, ended up kind of creating their own makeshift camp in these fields just north of Raqqa, because there was, and we can talk about this later, it's another part of the story, there was no more room in Raqqa. There was no place for them to stay.
One thing I know and I highly recommend your piece in the New Yorker, which really lays out a lot of the background, the history, the connections between the Syrian Defense Forces and the US going back years, and then bringing it up to the time of the Turkish incursion. There's one part I wanted to ask you about. You were talking about an SDF commander named Mazlum. and this question of when he was informed that the U.S. would be withdrawing after such a long relationship that he had had with them. Maybe just talk a little bit about that in terms of, as we're talking about those days when the U.S. was withdrawing.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And it's actually still a debatable question, is to what extent were the Kurds and were the SDF led to believe that they could depend on US support in the event of a Turkish incursion? Because it's not like this was a big surprise. I mean, for years, the Turks had been threatening to invade, and they had already mounted cross-border operations against the SDF. Erdogan's rhetoric had been growing progressively more belligerent as the SDF had grown, and that's a whole other story, because they had essentially started as this very small militia that at one point in 2014 looked like it was on the verge of being completely annihilated by ISIS when they were surrounded in Kobani. And from there, they had grown to a multi-ethnic force of around 100,000 fighters. And that was largely thanks to the support that the US had provided them as long as they were fighting ISIS and defeating ISIS all across the northern and eastern Syria. So from Erdogan's perspective, from the Turks' perspective, this was an alarming development, mainly because the SDF grew out of the PKK, which was a Turkish. It started out as a Turkish separatist movement, then it eventually renounced its separatist ambitions in favor of a more kind of complicated, nuanced desire for autonomy, what they call political autonomy. But in any case, it had been almost 4 decades long insurgency that the PKK had been waging against the Turkish government. There had been a brief ceasefire that fell apart in 2015. And so the Turks would say that the SDF was just essentially a Syrian branch of the PKK. The SDF will say, and General Mazloum would say, that that's not the case, that they're independent of the PKK. The truth is likely somewhere in between the two. It's undeniable that the two organizations are connected and that the PKK exercises influence throughout the hierarchy of the SDF. So our alliance with the SDF against ISIS in Syria was always complicated and always somewhat contradictory as a policy, as a U.S. policy, because of our concurrent alliance in NATO with Turkey, who viewed the SDF essentially as a terrorist group. So we kind of just ignored that contradiction and that problem because the SDF was so effective at fighting ISIS in Syria, and because we did not have another alternative. We had both the CIA and the Pentagon had attempted to create Arab opposition forces in Syria, and they were both just absolute abysmal failures. So Mazloum felt like, and many Kurds felt like they had earned a degree of fidelity from the U.S. Vis-a-vis Turkey because of their sacrifices in fighting ISIS, and a lot of their bloodiest and most costly battles were south of their territory, outside of what they called Rojava, the Kurdish homeland in northern Syria. So like Raqqa is not a Kurdish area, neither is Deir ez-Zor. But they had gone there when we asked them to, and they had defeated, they had wiped ISIS off the map. So so they expected a degree. They say that they expect, and they say that they were also led to believe, even explicitly told, that that the U.S. would not allow Turkey to attack them.
So then that changes.
Yeah, but
other players on the ground. Go ahead.
I should just also add that the U.S. vigorously denies this, and they say Jeffries, the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, has testified to Congress that no such guarantee was ever made. Trump has said repeatedly that no such guarantee was ever made. We don't know. Yeah.
So now, but once the U.S. have withdrawn, then the position changes with Russia involved and the Assad regime and the SDF. Bring us up to a little bit more up to date to right before your arrival there earlier this year. And then I'm really keen to hear about, as you're walking through these areas where the U.S. had been, or as you're walking through Raqqa, just to give people an update on that situation of the alliances there.
Yeah, so after the U.S. withdrew, Mazloum, who is the commanding general of the SDF, he reached out to the regime, the Assad regime, and its principal patron, Russia, to make a deal essentially so that they would replace the U.S. as a kind of bulwark against Turkey. And then Putin subsequently invited Erdogan to Sochi, where they worked out a ceasefire that kind of locked in place the territory that the Turks had already occupied, which is that rectangle I pointed out earlier on the map, and halted their advance there, because Erdogan actually wanted he had a much more ambitious plan originally and wanted to capture a vaster area than he ended up with. And so then you had a very odd situation with essentially Russian and regime forces co-located with Kurdish forces on this along this front line, across which were Turkish forces. And a lot of these Russians that came in to fill the void that the Americans left just ended up moving into American bases. So there were Russian flags flying from American combat outposts, and they took Shireen. They didn't take Lafarge, but we actually ended up bombing Lafarge after we pulled out of it, which was the Joint Command Center for U.S. and SDF military leaders throughout the campaign against ISIS. So this put Raqqa in a very precarious situation, because Raqqa is, in addition to being predominantly Arab, is anti-regime. It was always anti-regime, and essentially when Mazloum kind of invited the Russians and the regime to support the SDF against Turkey, that left Raqqa vulnerable to the regime, and the regime has made no secret that it wants very much to reclaim control of Raqqa. And so this was kind of a secondary effect of the US withdrawal that hasn't really been discussed too much, because America was the main force that expelled ISIS from the city, and in doing so, we completely destroyed the city, razed it to the ground with airstrikes and artillery and mortars. I've never seen a place so thoroughly annihilated physically by air power. And I covered Aleppo and Mosul and Sinjar and other places, other battles. So when we pulled out, we essentially, in addition to kind of leaving the Kurds in a vulnerable situation, we also left Raqqa in an extremely vulnerable situation after having destroyed it.
And you talk about in your piece, you talk about, as you were saying, just this annihilation of the city by the bombardment and the air power. But you were there after, as people were making this their homes, creating homes, and both in the city and outside because there was no more space. Mm. There's a part in your article where you talk about the issue of aid and the situation there of who will come to provide the financial backing to resurrect Raqqa. Can you explore that a little bit with us?
Yeah, that was one of the things that was surprising to me in reporting this article. I had covered the Battle of Raqqa in 2017, so I'd been there in the city while I was embedded with the SDF on the other side while it was being bombarded by the Americans, and I had been really surprised at the time by the aerial campaign that was being waged there, because there were estimated to be around 20,000 civilians still in the city at the height of the fighting when I was there, and it ended up being there's a reason why. I think there are specific reasons why Raqqa was destroyed the way it was, and one of them was that the SDF had no armored vehicles, and they had no heavy weapons, or they had few heavy weapons. They had very little personal protection equipment whatsoever, mainly because in order to appease Turkey, while we were supporting the SDF, we withheld a lot of the heavy material. They didn't have any tanks, they didn't have any MRAPs, they didn't have any armored personnel carriers. For the entire Raqqa offensive, they had 15 Humvees, and several of them were destroyed almost immediately by drones that ISIS was using that would drop grenades. In addition to that, so that meant that they were heavily reliant on airstrikes and artillery from the Americans, Marine artillery battalions and coalition jets and drones and helicopters. In addition to that, it was an Arab city, and while actually this doesn't get talked about a lot, but most of the fighters in the SDF, like the frontline ground troops in the SDF that were fighting and dying during the Battle of Raqqa, were actually Arabs. They weren't Kurds. but the commanders were all Kurds. And each frontline commander had a iPad that he would carry with him in a pouch kind of around his neck. And that iPad had a satellite image of the city downloaded on it. And just by touching a roof of a building on that iPad, it would give you the GPS coordinates, the grid coordinates. And then that commander, and these are not necessarily high-ranking, generals or colonels. These are just frontline guys. They could radio back to headquarters that position for an airstrike, and it was almost, and the majority of requests that I saw made in that manner were approved. And you combine that also with the fact that there was a prevalent belief among the SDF commanders during the battle, as well as among the Americans, as far as I know, and according to the public statements that they've made, that everyone in the city at that point was essentially ISIS or affiliated with ISIS, if they hadn't already left, which is preposterous. So you had this combination of factors of fighters that didn't have the equipment to deal with, to confront ISIS tactics on the ground, which are suicide vehicles, IEDs, suicide attackers, these kinds of things, and combined with a belief that there weren't really civilians to warrant concern about collateral damage. Also, there were extremely few journalists reporting on the battle there. Attention after the Battle of Mosul had kind of wandered, and it was just harder to get to, harder to cover. And that created a situation where it was just an unbelievable barrage of ordnance being unleashed daily on the city. So I forget, I kind of strayed from the original question, I think.
Well, I think just going to then what you saw when you came back there, just in terms of also the conversations you were having.
Oh, yeah, the reconstruction.
Aid, the reconstruction.
Yeah,
who's
so
paying
then,
for it and where's the funding?
Yeah, so then after the battle, you had this city that was completely destroyed. The UN estimated that 70% of structures in Raqqa were destroyed. Just based on what I saw personally, I feel like that's a lowball estimate. So just to compare it again with Mosul, in Mosul after the battle, which was damaged, though not as bad as Raqqa, you had immediately after the battle, Mosul was flooded with NGOs. It was flooded with money. The UN came in, started rebuilding houses. There was created a consortium of literally hundreds of NGOs, or over 100, I was told, different NGOs that were there to rebuild houses. The World Bank came in with a huge fund to rebuild infrastructure. A lot of different groups, including USAID, partnered with the Iraqi government. I mean, it's been a disaster in Mosul as well because of corruption and stuff. But in Raqqa, you had a situation where the government of the country viewed essentially that city as still, even after ISIS had been defeated, as a kind of terrorist territory, because it wasn't under government control. And so not only did the regime decline to invest in or help with rebuilding, but it also prevented the UN from doing so. And the UN has a policy, a very controversial policy, of essentially recognizing the sovereignty of the regime, of the Assad regime, and working in concert with it in Syria. So if the regime tells the UN they can't do something, the UN doesn't essentially doesn't do it. And what that means is that everywhere outside of regime-controlled areas in Syria, the UN really isn't doing the kind of projects that it normally would and that it does in Iraq. Same with the World Bank. So the burden really fell to the U.S. Working via the Raqqa Civil Council, which was the kind of Kurdish administration that had been put in there after the battle. But at first there was money allocated. There were State Department and USAID teams dispatched. There were implementing partners. The whole kind of development system kicked into gear. But Trump kind of promptly suspended the funding, and in December 2018 was the first time he threatened to said he wanted to pull all the troops out of Syria. And whenever U.S. troops pull out of an area, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria, all of the civilian side also follows them out. So that was an issue. Another issue, in addition to the kind of shortage of funding and lack of commitment, there was a policy predicament where, according to which the U.S. and other donor countries do not fund reconstruction in Syria, period. And this was a real surprise to me when I learned this. Basically, the most development agencies and donor countries refuse to pay for any kind of substantial, long-term, durable infrastructure investment in Syria, as long as it appears likely that that the regime will ultimately retake control of survive the civil war and emerge in control of the whole country.
So that goes, there's a question by Diego from the audience. We're gonna kind of intersperse some of those now that they're coming in. And his question is kind of hits that point. Is there a realistic chance that Raqqa will receive the aid it needs to be reconstructed? And it sounds like
well, as long as Assad remains in power, no. And as long as there's a possibility that the regime will ultimately recapture Raqqa, no. Like, donor countries do not want to be paying for new schools, new facilities, new infrastructure that's ultimately going to benefit the regime. And the kind of the really tragic part of that is that we, in withdrawing and in disengaging from Syria, have increased the likelihood of that happening. So, I wrote about this in the piece. A development officer gave me the example that a very practical and stunning example of how this policy plays out in practical terms. And that is, if a school, say, was minimally damaged by a US airstrike during the Battle of Raqqa and just needed some windows replaced and a new paint job, we can fund that. We would, according to the standing policy. But if it was destroyed, if it was flattened, if it needs, literally it's as detailed as if it requires load-bearing walls to be erected, we won't pay for that as a matter of policy. And in Raqqa, the vast majority of buildings are in the latter category, or require rebuilding. And so, yeah, you have a city 2 years after the battle in which it was destroyed, mostly by American arms, that still has no rebuilding going on. I mean, it's really, and that's not to say that nothing's happened. We've cleared out, it took a long time just to clear the rubble from the main roads, to get an electrical grid up and going, to get water. Electricity is still kind of work in progress, but to get water piped in. And so there has been, people have been working there, but in terms of rebuilding, there's nothing, and there won't be anything, as far as I know, as long as Assad remains in power, and it looks like that's going to be, indefinite.
And we have a question from Peter, who asks, if Rojava is an experiment in grassroots democracy, do you think it can survive? Or what is the thoughts on that after your conversations with folks on the ground? And I know you've had some calls with people afterwards, like with COVID-19 question.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I wouldn't call it an experiment.
Peter said the question is, Rojava is an experiment in grassroots democracy. Do you think it can survive?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't really call it an experiment in grassroots democracy. I don't think it's a very democratic. There's essentially one political party and not a lot of elections, and but it is an experiment in kind of Abdullah Öcalan would call it democratic confederalism, and which is pluralistic and inclusive, and compared to the rest of Syria, and whether that experiment can survive is also an open question. But I'll say this: another thing that surprised me there was how resilient the autonomous administration has turned out to be under extreme and diverse pressures. I think that the Turks kind of anticipated that they would invade and the whole system would collapse, but that's not what happened. The bureaucracy, which is a sprawling, very extensive, very complex bureaucracy. I forget how many people in Rojava work in one way or another for the bureaucracy, but it's a high proportion of the population. And that remained intact, even if they had to move their headquarters, as well. And so did the SDF. I think in this alliance of non-Kurdish forces that Mazloum had cobbled together over the years also pretty much stayed intact, and has withstood also efforts by the regime to undermine it. The regime has tried to get various Arab tribes by bribery and by offering other incentives to leave the SDF, and really hasn't succeeded. It's the forces have held together, and the bureaucracy has held together. Whether it will be able to continue to do so is hard to say.
Mm-hmm. Just shifting gears for one moment, we've had a couple of questions coming in about essentially journalists in both in terms of more risky areas as well as how do journalists raise awareness on these issues. So Joshua just asked, what do you do to practice journalism in such areas as when you were there embedded with SDF, as well as when you're just coming back to the region afterwards? And then Flaviana asks, since you had mentioned that there were very few journalists reporting from the field there, why do you think that is, and how can journalists contribute to increasing awareness on these issues? So two-part, what safety measures do you yourself take, and how can journalists, whether they're, able or not to get to the field, increase awareness on what's going on there, and in particular in Syria?
Yeah, I mean, there are a variety of best practices, I guess. It depends. Like this, when I was just there recently, there wasn't really much fighting going on, so that's a pretty easy scenario to navigate in terms of safety protocols. And I mean, just yeah. And right now, it's pretty safe, and I obviously kind of stick out. I guess you can't see, but I'm 6'4", and I have a red beard, but this last time I went with my friend. I don't speak Arabic, so I have to work with a translator, and I was fortunate enough on this last trip to be able to go with my friend from Iraq, Sengar Khalil, so and Sengar is just, he deserves a lot of credit as well for this project. And you just talk to people, and try to talk to the people you work with, talk to the people you meet, and try to get a sense of what's safe and what's not safe. And that's for a situation like that. And if it's a kinetic environment, if it's an actual frontline situation, that's totally different. But there again, there's no real general advice you can give, because every situation, especially these days, is so different.
Right. And as you've said, you've reported not only from Syria, but Afghanistan, from Iraq. In thoughts in terms of how the situations change, I know you've been embedded with different folks who you've met in Afghanistan. Maybe talk a little bit about those.
Let me just say that before I just realized that was, I totally punted on that question and really didn't provide anybody with any useful practical advice when it was asked. So if anybody is going to a war zone to report, anybody listening, and wants advice, specific advice on how to do it and how to be safe, please contact me, and I can talk to you personally.
Okay, that's great. But best way to contact you is?
My email, luke.mogelson@gmail.com.
Okay, thanks for that offer.
Yeah. Because it really depends on where you're going, when you're going, what you're doing. So yeah, but I'm happy to help.
Great, thank you.
So
in terms of comparison, I know you've met up with some relatives of folks, soldiers you had met in Afghanistan recently, just how those different scenarios that you've been involved with in these last few years.
Well, things are really different now. So I started doing this in 2010. I moved to Afghanistan, or 2011. And at that time, you could embed with US forces. US forces were still conducting a lot of frontline fighting, and you could embed with them. And I spent in 2011, I spent 2 months embedded with the Marines in Helmand province, and you're referencing a family of a Marine that I was with, and he was killed in Kajaki and Helmand, and I saw I'm in Michigan right now on another assignment, and his family is from here, and I spent the day with them for Memorial Day. And and for a period of time there, like, you know, the U.S. troops were a big part of these stories in Iraq and Afghanistan, not in Syria, but that's become less and less true as time has gone on, and now, I mean, they're kind of U.S. forces are kind of a marginal part of these wars. I mean, in the Battle of Mosul, which I covered, I was embedded with an Iraqi unit, and you know, we never saw, they were frontline fighting the whole time, and never saw an American. So the American role has really become relegated to air support and kind of or artillery far back from the front lines, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, or Syria. Yeah. So that's a very different situation when you're embedded, with local forces, whether it's Afghan or Iraqi or Syrian.
Just turning back to Syria, and then we'll be wrapping up. I know we haven't gotten to everyone's question in the audience, and we may be able to answer some of those online afterwards in our wrap up. One question that we haven't gotten to that has been in some of the news in terms of also referencing in your article is oil in Syria, and the role that may or may not have played in terms of U.S. forces, or whether Dave asks, is the U.S. apparently controlling, protecting Syrian oil fields? If true, where? And if is the SDF involved or getting any revenues? That's a multi-part. I don't know if that's something you can delve into here, but I guess give us a hint of what you are aware of.
Yeah, the answer would be yes, a qualified yes to both of those questions. The first is whether or not U.S. troops are protecting the oil fields. They are in a place called Rumilan, which is kind of which is in this bigger area called Jazeera, and also in the south in Deir ez-Zor. U.S. forces are kind of around oil fields and protecting them. I personally don't think that's the principal reason why they're in either Deir ez-Zor or Jazeera. And I go into that in the piece. It's kind of technical and complicated in both cases, so I won't get too into the weeds here. But essentially, and kind of to characterize it crudely, so to speak, I think when Trump ordered a complete withdrawal of U.S. forces when in October, when the Turks originally invaded, this really alarmed U.S. Commanders and diplomats who were working, partnering with the Kurds there. And they clearly did not agree with that decision and that move. And they wanted troops to keep troops there for a variety of reasons that have little to do with oil. And I think that the oil was used as a kind of way to convince Trump to reverse his policy, which he did. You know, he ended up sending back around 500 troops who are still there. And he always says, and he said it many times, that he made that decision for the oil, to protect the oil. That's fine. That, you know, like I say, the troops are around oil fields, but they're also doing other things, which I think are the real priorities of the U.S. military. Fighting ISIS, because there are still ISIS sleeper cells in Deir ez-Zor, keeping Iran at bay, and protecting the corridor that connects the border crossing that connects northern Syria to northern Iraq. Are the SDF earning revenue from the oil? Yes, a lot. And surprisingly, a lot of that revenue comes from the regime. The Kurds do not have refineries, so they extract crude, they ship it in trucks to Damascus or to regime territories. It gets, and then they buy back refined diesel and petroleum from the regime. So it's this kind of cycle in which both sides get what they earn money and get fuel.
Well, I do highly recommend not only to this part about the oil situation in your article, but the entirety of the article. We could probably talk a lot longer, but we're getting down to our time. So just want to thank Luke and thanks to our audience today for your interest and for your questions. And to my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Holly Peipenberg, who's our producer for today. So just wanted to wrap up here. And if folks could stay with us a few minutes longer, we just wanted to remind folks that there's a brief survey that will pop up once we're officially at the end of today's session. And we do appreciate your support for joining in with us today at our talk. And for those of you who are able to support us in other ways, remember we are a nonprofit journalism organization and we depend on our donors. We want to also let you know that we'll be kicking off our online summer Talks at Pulitzer series with a focus on justice. And on Tuesday, June 9th, we'll have a conversation between New York Times journalist Carol Rosenberg and David Cole, the National Legal Director of the ACLU. Their focus will be on Guantanamo, civil liberties, capital cases, and more. Carol has reported on Guantanamo since before the first prisoners arrived there, and she's the only reporter to cover the prisoners and the war court there continuously. She has spent well over 1,000 nights at the remote base, so please again join us on Tuesday, June 9th. And next week on Wednesday, June 3rd, we'll have another conversation on justice. Tatenda Nwaru, who's an intersex woman from Zimbabwe seeking asylum in the United States. She'll share her personal journey and her work advocating for intersex visibility. She's joined by filmmaker Robert Tokanel, who co-directed with Yuhong Pang, the Pulitzer Center-supported documentary, She's Not a Boy, featuring Tatenda. Robert and Yuhong were 2019 reporting fellows from the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. Please check over our event listings and you can see other sessions on justice as well as other topics throughout the year. And feel free to share these events and our reporting with your wider networks. Thank you again for your time with us today and have a good day.